Good evening. I'm Barbara Snyder, president of Case Western Reserve University. Well, thank you. I am so pleased to be here to welcome you to the first program in the 2018-2019 Think Forum Lecture Series featuring acclaimed social psychologist, Professor Jonathan Haidt, who is faculty member in ethical leadership at NYU's Stern School of Business. You're going to learn more about him in just a minute. We are always excited to have you in the beautiful Maltz Performing Arts Center. The Think Forum series is a spectacular group of speakers each and every year. This year, upcoming attractions include Julia Yaffe, a contributing writer at The Atlantic and former Russian correspondent for the New York Times, Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, literary scholar, writer, and professor at the University of Southern California. I want to begin by saying thank you for all they do each and every day for Case Western Reserve, to the members of our Board of Trustees who are here with us this evening, Vice Chair of the Board Tim Callahan, Ellen Mavick, Dr. Vince Gaudiani, Celia Weatherhead, and Emerita Trustee Sally Grease. Thank you all. You are my heroes for everything you do. And it is also great to be able to welcome tonight's community partner, the City Club of Cleveland. We're delighted that its CEO, Dan Malthrop, is here with us, and I want to say thank you to Dan for being with us and for your partnership. Thank you, Dan, wherever you are. And finally, thank you to our sponsors, the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, led by Dr. Marilyn Sanders Mobley, the Division of Student Affairs, led by Vice President Lou Stark, and the Center for Business Law and Regulation, led by Professor Jonathan Adler, and more about him imminently. These individuals and offices are among our strongest advocates on campus for promoting rigorous and respectful discussions among members of our campus community and the broader community on issues that affect us, whether it's at the local level or the national or the international level. And they do great work with our students, our faculty, and our staff. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Adler. He is the inaugural Johann Verheyen Memorial Professor of Law at our School of Law, and he is going to introduce this evening's speaker. Professor Adler is a renowned scholar of administrative law. His work focuses on regulatory policies related to the environment, as well as on constitutional issues, and he teaches courses on those topics. He is a prolific writer and has written or served as editor of 7 books and more than a dozen book chapters. His most recent books include Business and the Roberts Court and Rebuilding the Ark, New Perspectives on the Endangered Species Act and Reform. You see his writing in both the top law review journals and in the popular press, including in the Wall Street Journal, in the National Review, in the New Republic, Washington Post, USA Today. This year, he was listed as the 8th most cited public legal scholar in the country, and he is the only one of those scholars in the top 10 who is under 50 years old. Yes, the young Jonathan Adler. Professor Adler has testified before Congress many times on issues including healthcare reform, various environmental issues. His work is widely cited by the United States Supreme Court, as well as in many national newspapers and media outlets. He recently commented on the benefits and disadvantages of public congressional confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court nominees for Bloomberg, and provided his views about how the Supreme Court has addressed cases with precedent in recent history for the Wall Street Journal. When you hear him speak, you might recognize his voice because you hear him regularly on radio and television. He's appeared on PBS, on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ABC News, and NPR. In addition to being an excellent communicator of some of the country's most important and complex issues, he's also an outstanding teacher. Among his teaching awards is the Distinguished Teacher Award from our Law School's Alumni Association. We are so proud of everything that Professor Adler is doing. It is my pleasure to welcome him to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Please welcome Professor Jonathan Adler.
Thank you, Barbara. Somewhat awkward after an introduction like that because I'm not your speaker. But I'm very, very honored to be able to introduce our speaker this evening. A couple years ago, President Snyder and I were talking about the issues raised by the fact that it seems that people can't talk anymore about divisive and controversial issues and how that problem poses such a threat to the mission and place of a university, where we have to be free to speak, to inquire, to ask challenging questions, and to challenge ourselves. And in one of those conversations, I pointed to some of our speakers' work, and President Snyder said, well, get him to come speak here. So eventually we were able to do that. And although interestingly enough, this may have influenced the story in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about tonight's event. Some of you may have seen it. It has the headline, "Author Who Says Americans Are Too Sensitive to Speak at CWRU." I guess it's good that our reputation as a place of challenging inquiry and discourse is well known enough that Americans are too sensitive to speak here. But I'm quite happy that Professor Haidt is not among them. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be able to welcome him to our campus. Jonathan Haidt is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at the New York University's Stern School of Business. He previously taught at the University of Virginia. His life's work, or his dominant work, has been to try and apply the insights of moral psychology to help institutions function better, whether that's political institutions, business institutions, or in much of his current work, the university, which led him to co-found an organization called Heterodox University, which is in part about making sure that universities remain a place where we can talk to each other, we can exchange ideas, and feel free to speak and inquire. You haven't come here to hear me, so I will wrap up, but he's the author of several books, The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, which I heartily recommend, and the book that is the inspiration for his talk tonight, the book that is already a New York Times bestseller, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Or sorry, that's the one I just told you about. The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. It's only been out a few weeks. It's been consistently on the New York Times bestseller list, where I expect it will remain for some time. It offers some interesting and perhaps challenging ideas about why we are where we are and what to do about it. So again, you didn't come here to listen to me. So with no further ado, it's really my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Professor Jonathan Haidt.
Well, good evening. If I was afraid to speak here, that warm introduction and welcome would put me at ease, so thank you for that. And this beautiful room, this is a lovely venue to speak at. I'm very pleased to be here talking to you tonight. I had some great conversations earlier today, one with the students at lunch, and then another with faculty and administrators afterwards. And as I speak at various universities, and as I've just wrote a book, co-wrote a book on this, it seems as though CASE is in pretty good shape. There are titanic forces that are reshaping and challenging institutions of all sorts in our country, and not just in our country, in other democracies as well. It's a very complicated, difficult time. What I saw today at least suggests that so far CASE is doing very well at it. That is, it's addressing the issues, addressing concerns and demands from students, but people are doing it in a civil way. The faculty and administrators are thoughtful about, well, how do we respond to these new issues? How do we change orientation? How do we teach students to dialogue with each other in ways that don't lead to blow-ups, but lead to understanding? So I'm very pleased by what I've seen here today. Now, the issues that I'm talking about they first emerged on college campuses, but it's clear now that they're spreading down into high schools and even elementary schools. They're spreading out into the workplace. So even if you don't care about universities, even if you don't care about this university, and no, I shouldn't even say that because everybody here loves this university, these issues, I think, are ones that it will help you to understand, because you're going to see them in the newspaper tomorrow. You're going to see them in strange things that people say that you can't understand unless you understand this new morality which is coming in. And let's try to understand that. So let's start with universities. It's very helpful when analyzing some institution to talk about its telos. Telos is a word from ancient Greek. Aristotle and other philosophers thought it was helpful to speak about anything in terms of, to analyze it in terms of its telos, its purpose or function. And so if we talk about a knife, what's the telos of a knife? It's to cut. So if a knife doesn't cut well, it's a bad knife. What's the telos of a physician? It is to heal. So if there's a physician who's not very good at healing, he or she is not a good physician. So what's the telos of a university? If we're going to evaluate universities, we need to do it with respect to what is their telos. Now, we certainly have an idea. Within the academy, we trace our origins back to Plato's academy, to Socrates and the philosophers up on the hill outside Athens. This is Raphael's School of Athens with Plato and Aristotle in the center. And there's a lot of contention. They're talking, they're arguing, but it's all very civil. And in the process, something happens, something emerges. What is it that a good university does? Well, the answer is contained on the crest of many or most schools. So Veritas is at the University of, is at Harvard. Yale throws on the word lux or light as well. So it's usually Veritas or light. Sometimes it's knowledge. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Animal House was at Faber University. I think it was knowledge is good, was their motto. So the telos is truth. They are these special institutions that when they are well constituted, they find truth, they diffuse it, they send it to the next generation, they preserve it from previous generations. And there's something we tell ourselves about ourselves, which is that we are fearless. I taught for 16 years at the University of Virginia, and all over the campus grounds, I should say, it says, "For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, so long as reason is left free to combat it." So fearlessness in pursuit of truth. Well, the story that brings me here today, the story that led to the book, is that my co-author, Greg Lukianoff, is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It advocates for student rights. It pushes back on schools that are constantly trying to restrict students' rights to speech and over-control their lives. And Greg had been doing that since 2000. Now, in 2007, he had a very serious, truly suicidal depression. And he committed himself to a hospital, and then when he was released, he underwent therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's a technique which I'll say more about, but in which you learn to challenge your distorted thoughts, and in the process you improve your thinking, and then you actually, the depression lifts. So that was in 2008, and then as he continued his work, mostly pushing back against administrators, while the students were, as he says, always the best constituency. The students wanted free speech. The students didn't want to be overprotected. But suddenly in 2013, 2014, Greg began to see the students espousing exactly the same cognitive distortions that he had learned not to do. Catastrophizing, black and white thinking, mind reading, all sorts of, I'll show you those later, but all sorts of cognitive errors. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. So Greg was puzzled by this, and so he invited me to lunch. He'd read my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, where I talk about CBT. And he met me through a mutual friend, invited me to lunch, shared his idea with me that strange things are happening on campus because somehow students are learning to think in distorted ways, and this is likely to make them depressed and anxious. So I loved his idea. I thought it was brilliant. And I provided this psychology. I'm a social psychologist. I provided the psychology to work this up into an article which we published. We submitted to The Atlantic in 2015, and it was finally published in August of 2015. Now, what was happening in the meantime is we began to see, only in 2014, we began to see the first articles about trigger warnings, demands students would make to be warned before a book or idea or speaker would say something that might upset students. Safe spaces. We'd all heard of safe spaces in Srebrenica and places that the UN is protecting people, but the idea that a classroom should be a safe space where people's ideas will not be challenged or attacked was new. And so the front page of the New York Times, or the review section, debate at Brown between two feminists. Some students were very upset. They thought that this could be very dangerous for brown students to hear this debate because it could invalidate some people's experiences. And if that happened, those students would be damaged by witnessing this debate. So they needed a safe space, a place they could go recover or stay away from the initial debate. We began seeing articles like this where professors were saying they were afraid of their students. So something is changing on campus. Ideas seem dangerous. Students seem to be wanting protection, demanding protection. And sure enough, if you look at it more quantitatively, Google Trends, you put in the words trigger warning or microaggression, which I'll come back to. They don't exist before 2011, and they only really become things in 2014, 2015. So something new was emerging on campus around 2014, plus or minus a year. We wrote this up, published it in August of 2015, tried to explain Greg's theory, and then we went back to our day jobs and things that we were doing. And it was only at Halloween that all hell broke loose on some campuses. And many of these things we were talking about suddenly became household words. It was very clear that there was a new moral culture on some campuses. So protests begin at Yale over an email about Halloween costumes. Nobody wore a bad costume, but there was an email about wearing costumes that led to a controversy, which then spread quickly to at least 80 schools, students making demands of the administration, largely for a lot of protections. A new moral culture is emerging that was very hard for people to understand. At first, it wasn't really a left-right issue because older people, whether they're on the left or the right, professors, university presidents, all believe in free speech. So it was a very confusing time. It escalates through the Trump election, through the 2016 election. Fortunately, there's been very little actual violence, but there are a few episodes with true violence, the protests at Berkeley being the most spectacular ones. Nobody's been killed so far, but there have been a number of people injured. At Berkeley, we saw an idea that's become very common now on campus, which is that words are violence. And if words are violence, then shutting down a speaker violently is self-defense. So violence, this is the words of students at Berkeley, violence helped ensure the safety of students. Asking people to maintain peaceful dialogue with those who legitimately do not think their lives matter is a violent act in itself, and therefore violence is justified to stop these people. More actual violence at Middlebury College, students protesting a talk by Charles Murray that attacked him and a political science professor who got a concussion and possibly permanent neck injury. Protests have sometimes moved inside classrooms. Some students now will take bullhorns into classrooms and disrupt classes in order to make themselves heard. Again, this is not common. It's not that it's happening every day, but it does happen so much so that professors and administrators are on the defensive. For example, I don't take any chances at NYU. I do not say anything controversial. I can be controversial with you because you can't report me. You can't do anything to me if I say something that offends you. But if I'm at NYU, there's a sign in every bathroom telling students what number to call or what email to send to report me or anyone else who says something that they think is offensive. So I just don't take chances at NYU. So the puzzle that we're here to discuss is, what is this new culture, where did it come from, and what are its effects? The way you can recognize it is if you see these terms, safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, if you see things described as matrices of oppression, if there is what students refer to as a call-out culture, and if this call-out culture tends to focus not on things that people did to each other, but typically on a single word. It really often anchors on a single word. People will be called out for using a word. So what we think is happening here is that students think that they are fragile. Now, it's not clear whether they think that they themselves are fragile or whether they're standing up for other students whom they think are so fragile that they will be damaged if this speaker were to come to campus or if this book were to be assigned. So they think that other students are fragile and that this is all occurring in a dangerous or hostile country. Now, you could make a case for that if you like. That is certainly possible. But it tends to also be that the university is a dangerous and hostile place. And so therefore, students need protection at the university from a variety of threats that are not physical threats. So that's the puzzle. Where did this come from? Why did it emerge so suddenly? It's not at most universities. That is, America has 4,500 institutions of higher education, and at most of them you don't see this. But if you look just at elite schools in the Northeast and along the West Coast, you do. They're at pretty much all of them as far as I can tell. Now, why this is happening, much of the book concerns this. I won't go into this. This would take a long time. But there's no easy answer. There's no one answer. We think it's a really fascinating puzzle for a social scientist. It's a great time to be a social scientist because things are changing and all in interrelated ways. So just very briefly, we put this in the context of rising political polarization in the United States with the political purification of the universities. That is, they used to lean left, but now they're so far on the left that, in terms of the faculty, that in many departments or in many fields, there's hardly any conservatives. And that just means that since we all believe that diversity makes us think better, diversity confronts us with opposing views, in many fields there is not a diversity of ideas. So if students aren't exposed, say, to conservative ideas, when a conservative speaker comes to campus, it's very threatening. Number two, rising anxiety and depression, which I'll show you in a moment. That's just since 2011 and linked, we think, to social media. Paranoid parenting. We began raising kids very differently in the 80s and especially the 1990s. Part of that is that we've deprived kids of free play since the 1990s. I'll tell you about that more. The growth of bureaucracy at universities, rise of much greater fears of being sued, so a very defensive posture, also a kind of a consumer mindset that the students are consumers rather than students. And lastly, there are a variety of changes in thinking about social justice and what exactly justice requires. So it's really complicated. It's fascinating. These all interrelate. Most of these are happening in the UK and Canada as well. They're not happening so much on the continent. It's a distinctively Anglosphere problem. But in all the English-speaking countries, they're a little behind us, about a year behind us. But all of our countries are moving in the same way on most of these trends. So that's why it happened. As for understanding what is happening, what is this new culture, what I want to talk to you about tonight is the central part of the book, which is that there are three really, really bad ideas. Ideas so bad that if we could just convince students to accept them, we can pretty much guarantee that they will have lives of failure and misery and lack of effectiveness. So what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. And view life as a battle between good people and evil people. These are three really terrible ideas. Let me explain why. So my first book is called The Happiness Hypothesis. It grows out of the introductory psychology course that I taught at UVA. And in teaching psychology, I would quote from the ancients and Shakespeare and religious texts. And I found that the ancients were just horrible at biology and chemistry and physics, but they were very wise about psychology, human nature, human relationships. And so I scanned ancient wisdom from all over the world and organized it into 10 ideas that the ancients had in multiple cultures. And then I analyzed the psychology. So let's talk about 3 of them. So there's a very common idea, it's chapter 7 of the book, on the uses of adversity. So the bad idea, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, you all recognize as being the opposite of what Friedrich Nietzsche said when he said, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. There's a basic psychological principle here. The word is antifragility. It's a wonderful word, or rather it's an ugly, clunky word, but it's necessary. Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, coined it. Actually, I'll get to that in a moment. So the idea that it's a great truth is that it occurs to people in the West and the East. So Muntze or Mencius said, when heaven is about to confer a great responsibility on any man, it will exercise his mind with suffering, subject his sinews and bones to hard work, etc., so as to stimulate his mind, harden his nature, and improve wherever he is incompetent. So again, great thinkers, East and West, have come to this realization. Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, wrote a very interesting book called Antifragile. He had to make up this word because we don't have a word for this in English. He's kind of sick of hearing about the word resilience. Sure, we want our kids to be resilient, but what does it mean to be resilient? He talks about you could be fragile, so a wine glass is fragile, you should protect it, you should never drop it. A plastic cup is resilient. You can give a toddler a plastic cup because if she drops it, nothing bad will happen to it. But the cup doesn't get better from being dropped. And what Taleb wanted to capture, and here he's writing after the global financial crisis, where he's one of the few people who predicted it. He observed before the financial crisis that our banks were in a fragile state, that they were never really tested properly, and that unless they had experienced a variety of threats and coped with them, they were liable to catastrophic failure. So he predicted that the whole thing was going to collapse, and it did. And in the wake of that, he's trying to say we need to understand that there are systems that are anti-fragile. There are systems that need to get dropped. They need to get kicked, knocked, challenged, or they can't become strong. And so he gives examples. So bones, if you don't put any pressure on your bones, if you fly to Mars and you're weightless for 7 months, when you get to Mars, your bones aren't going to work very well. Bones are anti-fragile. They need challenge. The immune system is the classic case. I'll go into that in a moment. And then he talks about children. So let's talk about these. So peanut allergies. We have a very mixed age audience here of all ages. Those of us who went to school before the 1990s, we took peanut butter and jelly sandwiches quite often. Nobody talked about peanut allergies because they were extremely rare. Now peanut allergies are much more common. The rate tripled between the early 1990s and about 2010. The rate tripled. Why? Why have peanut allergies been going up? Well, a number of researchers on the immune system had theories, and they tested it in a major trial that came out, a major study that was published about 2 years ago, in which they, as they wrote, peanut allergy is an aberrant response by the body's immune system to harmless peanut proteins. The prevalence of peanut allergy has doubled over the last 10 years. That was when they were writing. But only in the US and other countries that advocate avoidance of peanuts during pregnancy, lactation, and infancy. In those countries, such as ours, where we keep women away from peanuts, peanut allergies go up. So they thought, let's put this to the test. This study was based on the hypothesis that regular eating of peanut-containing products will elicit a protective immune response rather than an allergic immune reaction. What did they do? They solicited, they got the participation from 640 women who were pregnant with infants, or they recruited the infants who were at high risk of immune problems because they either had eczema or they had an egg allergy, both of which illustrate that you have some sort of immune issue. And what they did was they randomly assigned half of them to consume, it's an Israeli snack made of puffed corn dusted with peanut powder, little peanut taste. So kids love this stuff. So in infancy, give your kid stuff with peanut dust or follow standard advice and keep your kid clear because, my God, your kid's at higher risk of peanut allergies. So don't go near peanuts. And then they tracked them very carefully. And at 5, when they tested them, they gave them an immune test to see how their bodies responded. Of those who were given the standard advice to avoid peanuts, 14% of them had a peanut allergy, meaning that for the rest of their life, perhaps, they were going to have to avoid peanuts or they could die. 2% of those who were exposed to peanuts had allergies. You can cut the rate almost all the way by giving kids peanuts. So what they said in the description at the end is they say, for decades, allergists have been recommending that young infants avoid consuming allergenic foods, but our findings suggest that this advice was incorrect and may have contributed to the rise in peanut and other food allergies. So this is a really, really clear example of how good intentions and bad ideas have set up a generation for problems. Okay, let's try that again. Let's take a whole generation of kids and let's protect them. Let's protect them from everything we can. Let's always be there for them. Don't let them out. Don't let them in a place where they could get injured. We have to be there for them to protect them. And of course, then when they go off to college, we have to be there too because they won't know what to do. So we have to be there for them. Let's protect them. Now, here's a playground from about 100 years ago. Okay, in my opinion, this is too dangerous. Kids could actually die from this. Okay, so, I'm not, don't get me wrong here. We need to pay attention to safety. This is, I don't know the year on this, but it's more recent. And as you see, kids could get hurt here, but it's hard to see how they could die. But yeah, you really, you could get hurt here. You could fall from those rings and you could twist an ankle even. You might bang your head. I think this is probably just right because the playgrounds that my kids go to are like this, or this. And there was a really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal last year by a developmental psychologist titled, "Should We Let Toddlers Play with Saws and Knives?" Because in Germany and Switzerland, they do. They let kids play with tools, they let them play with sharp objects, fire, they get burned, and then they learn not to touch hot things. And what Gopnik says here is she says, trying to eliminate all such risks from children's lives also might be dangerous. There may be a psychological analog to the hygiene hypothesis, which is the idea that if you keep your kids bacteria-free, you damage their immune system, similar to the peanut issue. There may be an analog to that to explain the dramatic recent increase in allergies. There could be an analogy where when we protect kids from risk, we have bad outcomes. She says, in the same way, by shielding children from every possible risk, we may lead them to react with exaggerated fear to situations that aren't risky at all, like a book or a visiting speaker that you don't have to go to. Students may come to react with exaggerated fear to situations that aren't risky at all, and we may isolate them from the adult skills that they will one day have to master. So the dictum, the folk wisdom, and in our book it's based on, we have 3 quotes at the beginning, this is one of them. Prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. Most of you in here look like you have children, or at least you're of an age where you could have children. Actually, raise your hand if you're an undergraduate. Raise your hand high if you're an undergrad here at Case, or anywhere. Okay. All right, so we've got probably about 30 or so. Raise your hand if you are a parent. Raise your hand high. Okay, a lot more parents. Raise your hand if you're a grandparent. How many grandparents do we have here? Wow, a lot of grandparents. Okay, good. So we have multiple generations to compare. And it's quite striking when I had my talk with the students and I asked them at what age they were allowed to go outside, like walk 6 blocks to a friend's house or go to a store. And if let me ask the grandparents, just call it out. At what age do you think that you were allowed to just like be outside where an adult was not taking care of you? Just call it out. Right. So we just heard mostly 5 and 6 and some as high as 8. Okay, and that's what it was when I was growing up. I was born in 1963, and even as crime was rising, the 70s and in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of crime, but it was still by 6 or 7, you're walking to school, and at 8, you're out playing. You come home when the lights go out. When the sun sets, you come home. I talked with the students here today. Well, let me see. Okay, so current undergraduates, just call it out. Think about for a moment. How old were you when your parents allowed you out? Like just you're out playing. You'll come back. They're not, nobody's watching you. Just call it out. Yeah, so mostly 13 to 15. I heard 1 or 2 9s. In our conversation, one woman said 6, and I looked at her, and she said, but that was in the Philippines. Once we moved here, it was 14. Okay, so what are we doing? We're keeping our kids so safe that we don't give them a chance to learn how to walk on rough roads. Then we send them off to college. In Britain, they're beginning to get it. In Britain, they're a little ahead of us. In Britain, they're starting to realize, ultra-safe playgrounds are not good for kids. They don't learn anything. So they're actually putting construction materials on playgrounds. And yeah, you could pinch your fingers. You could get hurt. This is a great photo. If you see what the kid's doing, he's making a catapult. He's going to send some bricks up in the air. Okay. Okay. He's going to learn something. Okay. But what do we do in America? In America, we just keep going. Universities banning snowball fights and water guns because, what if a snowball hits someone in an eye? Now, it's very important to note here that what's going on campus, the new culture that came in 2014 is not the millennials. A lot of you see, I read this all the time. Oh, those coddled millennials, those snowflake millennials. Not true at all. The millennials are not very different from Gen X and previous generations. The change happens with the generation after the millennials. We all thought until a few years ago that millennials were kids born between 1982 and 2000 or so. But no, that's not true. There's a book called iGen. It goes through all the numbers. There's a sharp break at birth year 1995. Kids who were born in 1995 had very different childhoods, and their outcomes are becoming very, very different. So just to show you, this is data from Jean Twenge from 4 nationally representative surveys. So the percent of 12th graders who, the top line is, have a driver's license. Now, if you're over 40 or so, and you think about when did you get your driver's license, what day did you get it on, you probably know because it's within 36 hours of your birthday, right? Of your you know? Like you're there, camped out, because like we couldn't wait to get a driver's license. But in recent years, a lot of high school students are not even getting a driver's license. They don't go out very much. What do they need a car for? The percent who have ever tried alcohol. And again, now there you may not know when you first tried alcohol because it may have been back in like junior high school or something. So, but have you ever tried alcohol? The number that have ever tried it is dropping very rapidly. Have you ever gone out on a date or had something more or less like a date? Have you ever worked for pay? On all of these things, they were beginning to drop for the late millennials, kids born in the early 90s, but once iGen, or Gen Z, you might have heard of it as Gen Z, once Gen Z enters the data set, these life experiences that all involve kids doing deviant things, well, work isn't deviant, but things, well, now it is, all right. Doing things that give them an independent life out of the eye of their parents. They are responsible for themselves, they're taking risks for themselves, they're not being supervised by their parents. Those plummeted beginning with kids born in 1995. And again, this is not their fault, it's the way adults, you know, my generation, the way we treated our kids and social media, those two things combined have really changed the childhoods of kids born after 1995. And here are the results. This is federal data. The number of the percent who have had at least one major depressive episode in the past year. And that's defined, there are 9 symptoms. If you say yes to 5 of them, you count as having had a major depressive episode. So the rate for girls has shot up from about 12% to 19%. So 1 in 5, almost 1 in 5 teenage girls has had a major depressive episode. It's way up as soon as iGen enters the data set. Boys is up slightly, that is actually up, I mean, as a percentage it's up, but it's not nearly as dramatic as what's happened for girls. Now, limited to college students, same thing. Back in 2012, when the question was asked, do you have a psychological disorder of any sort? And they gave depression as an example. What percent of students say yes? And so what we see is when in 2012, when it was all millennials, it was about 3% of college men and about 6% of college women. But by 2016, when millennials are gone and it's all iGen, the numbers are way up for both genders. For women, it's about 15% of women say that they have a psychological disorder. These are college women, about 1 in 6 or so say that they have a psychological disorder. And that's a big change from just 5 or 6 years ago. Now, last week or 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, an article appeared by a psychiatrist who I normally like. I still like him, but I think he's wrong when he says the big myth about teenage anxiety. And he says, don't worry about all these reports you hear. There's little evidence of an epidemic of anxiety disorders. It's just based on self-report measures. And these self-report measures are overestimates. Don't worry, it's not happening. No, he's wrong. Here's some data which is not self-report. This is a nationally representative sample of hospitals, admission data, what percentage of their catchment area of the age group, what percentage, they can calculate a rate per 100,000 of girls and boys who are admitted because they harmed themselves in a way that was not fatal. These are not suicides, these are like cutting yourself, taking poison, doing something that puts you in the hospital, but you're not dying. And so what you see here is if we trace the data out until 2009, there's no trend. From 2001 to 2009, there's no trend. As soon as iGen comes in, trend. But note, if you just look at the middle bar, the orange bar, this is just girls. If you look at girls who are in their 20s, no trend. So these are millennials. They're not up. Look at girls age 15 to 19, the top line. They start going up pretty much as soon as they get an iPhone. Look at the bottom line. Ages 10 to 14. That's a very, very steep increase, several 100% increase in terms of the ratio. So there's something going on with especially teenage girls who have been somehow damaged by something. Jean Twenge thinks it's mostly social media. When boys get iPhones, they basically play video games all day long. When girls get social media, they're doing things that involve social comparison and relational aggression at times. So that's, at least, we don't know why it's happening, but that's the leading candidate for why we have a crisis of mental health for teenage girls born after 1995. And most alarmingly, and again, not self-report data, the suicide rate. So it's up so this is, what I did was, this is federal data, CDC data. I calculated the average suicide rate per 100,000 for 2001 to 2010, and then you compare that to the last 2 years of data, 2015, 2016, averaged to make it smoothed out. The boys' suicide rate is up 25%, which is gigantic. 25% increase just since 2011. For girls, that increase is 70%. 70% increase in the suicide rate for teenage girls. This is not self-report data. This is not some panic cooked up by the media. These are a lot of dead teenagers. We're seeing this all over the place, wherever young people are. College mental health centers are overwhelmed. They've been overwhelmed since about 2013 or 2014 is when these articles started appearing. And so again, in a lot of ways, whatever it is we're doing, something is going wrong with the mental health, especially for girls, but also for boys. Somehow we're setting them up for failure. And so the principle here, the psychological principle, is that people are anti-fragile. And what I want to do to bring it back to case is, let's imagine a university that was built on the idea that people are fragile, students are fragile, we must protect them. We must protect them from unpleasant experiences, from feeling threatened, from feeling emotionally unsafe. Or imagine a different university that was based on this wisdom principle rather than the bad idea. Prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. All right, let's keep going. Let's look at a different chapter of the happiness hypothesis. Chapter 2, changing your mind. So the bad idea is always trust your feelings, and it's a bad idea because it contradicts a very basic psychological principle, which is that we are all prone to emotional reasoning and the confirmation bias. This is the widest principle. This is the most universal principle of ancient wisdom. Wherever you look, you will find sages who have articulated this principle. So Epictetus wrote that what really frightens and dismays us is not external events themselves, but the way in which we think about them. It is not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of their significance. Of course, famously in Hamlet, Shakespeare writes, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And in Paradise Lost, Milton writes, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." You find it in the East as well. Buddha says, "Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts unguarded, but once mastered, no one can help you as much, not even your father or your mother." Learn to think for yourself. Learn to question your automatic reactions. What filters are you applying to the world? Choose your filters carefully. Buddhism, of course, is a set of procedures and paths and meditation for gaining control of the elephant, gaining control of your first reactions and having more considered, mature, calm reactions and interpretations. Aaron Beck, one of the founders of cognitive therapy in the West, rediscovered these principles in the 1960s and developed one of the most effective cures for depression and anxiety out there. What Beck discovered is that people who are severely depressed have very negative views about the world, about the future, and about themselves, and they're self-reinforcing. They believe all kinds of terrible things about themselves and the world and their future. And if Beck could get them to examine some evidence, work with them to test one of their assumptions, and they see it's not true, it would have a liberating effect, and then that would allow them to question the others. But then they go right back to it, 10, 20 minutes later. But if you work with them over the course of a few weeks to question their assumptions, to look for evidence, question their distorted cognitions, he found that he could cure depression and anxiety. So many of you in this room have done CBT in some form. The core of it is you learn the names of these distortions. You learn to recognize them in yourself. Mind reading, fortune telling, catastrophizing. The most basic of them all, the most important one in general, I think, is emotional reasoning, which is our feelings do guide our thinking. A lot of my prior research was on that in moral judgment. But when you decide how the world is based on how you're feeling at the moment, that is emotional reasoning, and in CBT you learn to stop doing that. You learn to look for external validation. Is this true or not true? So this was the idea at the heart of our Atlantic article, that somehow students were learning or being encouraged to do more emotional reasoning, and it was leading to some of these blow-ups on campus, and it's really bad for their mental health. Now, I want to focus, for this part, I want to focus on an idea that has become very common at universities. A lot of the coverage early on was on trigger warnings, which are not very common, but the idea of microaggressions is a very, very common idea. In fact, raise your hand if you've heard of this, if you know what a microaggression is. Raise your hand high. Raise your hand if this is the first time you're hearing the term. Raise your hand high. Okay, a bunch of people with gray hair are saying that, okay. So it was a very important article by a psychologist named Gerald Wing Su. And so a racial microaggression, it's a brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. And this is very, very important, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Now, the idea contains two things that are very good and one thing that's very bad, I think. So, as the word suggests, a microaggression is a useful term because, you know, as overt acts of explicit racism, certainly on campus, are way, way down since, you know, the 50s and 60s, as really overt, obvious acts of racism are way down, we need a term for subtle things, small things, where maybe it's deniable. Hey, I didn't mean anything by that. So it's useful to have the concept of a microaggression. That's a perfectly valid concept, I think. Now, one of the points of the article, though, is that if you're a person of color, if you're LGBTQ on campus, a lot of things happen that maybe there was no bad intent, but it still makes you uncomfortable. You have to deal with it over and over again. That's a very useful concept. But I suggest we should call that a faux pas, that we should not call that an act of aggression. So it's useful for us to have a conversation on a college campus about all the dumb things people say that every East Asian person hears dozens of times every week about oh, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Or something like that. So it's important to have a way to talk about these things. That's great. But the word should be faux pas. A faux pas is the French word for a false step. We use it in English as an embarrassing or tactless act or remark. It's a mistake, a blunder, a gaffe, an indiscretion. We need to talk about this. But the really bad thing about the microaggression program is that it specifically says that intent does not matter. We should judge each other not by what they meant, but how you feel. Judge by how you feel. After all, in the end, what does the intent of our action really matter if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalization or oppression of those around us? Now, the reason this is such a destructive idea, and it is so bad, especially for members of historically marginalized groups, is this. At all of our universities, we are working really hard to increase diversity and to work on inclusion. I shouldn't say all, but as far as in most universities, every place I've been, we're trying hard. Now, what happens when you increase diversity? You're guaranteed to have more misunderstandings. It's almost by definition. Let's take people who don't share a common set of assumptions and norms and rules of behavior. Let's take a lot of international students. Let's get a lot more social class diversity. Let's bring all kinds of people from diverse backgrounds together and put them into intense conversations about race and gender and politics and all sorts of things. Diversity means more and more and more misunderstandings, more and more faux pas. It's guaranteed. So what should we do about that? Could that be beneficial? If we handle it right, it could be really beneficial. So here are two ways we could handle it. Option A is we teach students to be more polite. We teach them about microaggressions and racial or gender, whatever, faux pas. We teach them about them. We say, do less of this. And at the same time, in our community, as we struggle to do this, give each other the benefit of the doubt. This is hard. Diversity is hard. Cut each other some slack. That's one way we could handle it. Here's another. How about if we teach students to focus on emotional impact, ignore intent, do not think about whether the person meant something. If you feel marginalized, that person committed an act of aggression against you. And now you can go into any bathroom and you will find the number to call to report that person to the appropriate dean. What do you think? Which way is likely to lead to more harmony, inclusion, calm, friendship, and learning from diversity? So I ask you to consider two different kinds of university. One is based on the idea that you should always trust your feelings, and by the way, here's how you can be more outraged. And two, those negative feelings are traumatizing and they will leave a permanent scar on you. Imagine what it would be like to be at a university like that, or imagine a university based on the opposite ideas. All right, now, very briefly, I'll just do the last one very briefly because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Chapter 4 of the Happiness Hypothesis was on hypocrisy and self-righteousness. In every culture that has left us writing about human nature and relationships, we find ideas about this. So the bad idea is that life is a battle between good people and evil people, and the good idea is that we're all prone to dichotomous thinking, or dividing the world into good and evil, and tribalism based on that. So the opening quote we use is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Soviet, he wasn't even a dissident. He wrote a negative thing about Joseph Stalin in a letter to a friend during World War II. His letter was read, he was thrown into the Gulag for decades, for a long time. And while he's marching off to the Gulag, presumably to die, he looks at a guard who's marching him and he realizes, you know what? I could just as well have been that guard. If things had been different, he would have been the guard marching people to their death. And he writes, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Okay, this is wisdom. We see the same thing certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but you do not notice the log in your own? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye." So wise people, East and West, ancient times and modern, know we are all by nature hypocrites, prone to saying we're good, you're bad. Combine that hypocrisy with tribalism. I love this Bedouin metaphor. I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and cousins against the world. Humans are tribal creatures. We're very good at this. So if you imagine tribes of hypocrites, which is basically human beings, tribes of hypocrites put together, should we be calming down the tribal sentiments or ramping them up? Sometimes in some parts of universities, we ramp them up. There's what's called a call-out culture. There's a kind of a mindset that goes with it. And so this was actually from a Canadian student from 2014, but it really captures the cognitive effects of it. It's a really brilliant essay. I'll just go through part of it very quickly. So Trent Eady, he's a queer activist since high school. He goes to McGill University in Montreal, becomes much more radical. But by his fourth year of college, he realizes, oh my God, what have I done? He steps back and he writes, "I used to endorse a particular brand of politics that's prevalent at McGill and in Montreal more widely. It begins with good intentions and noble causes, but it metastasizes into a nightmare. I've pinned down 4 core features that make it so disturbing: dogmatism, groupthink, a crusader mentality, and anti-intellectualism." And then he says, I've done everything I'm about to say, I am guilty of myself, he says. So just look at that list. Look at that list of ways of being and think whether you've encountered that, especially on the internet. These are the hallmarks of the tribal mind preparing for battle. These ways of thinking are absolutely incompatible with what we're trying to do at a university. He says, "Thinking this way quickly divides the world into an in-group and an out-group, believers and heathens, the righteous and the wrongchous. Every minor heresy inches you further away from the group. When I was part of groups like this, everyone was on exactly the same page about a suspiciously large range of issues." So I want to ask the younger people, if you're under 25 in this audience, think about have you come across people on the internet, have you seen this way of thinking and behaving? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Okay, and raise your hand if the answer is no, you've not seen this before. Okay, nobody, so everybody has encountered it. Now, let me ask if you see it at CASE, if you see people like this, if this is part of the discourse community at CASE. Raise your hand if just those of you who raised your hand before, raise your hand if you've seen this at CASE, among CASE students. Raise your hand high. Okay, and raise your hand if you have not seen it at CASE. All the same, okay, so everybody said they have seen it at Case. So it is here. My sense is that it's not nearly as dominant as it is at schools in New England and in California and Washington State, but clearly it is here. It is everywhere. This is call-out culture. It's really scary. It really makes you self-censor, because if you just say what you think, you could be in a lot of trouble. This is just a couple of cartoons. I hear it's because we're right and they're wrong. And this is my favorite. There can be no peace until they renounce their rabbit god and accept our duck god. So this problem, this way of thinking, it's a common human way. We need to actively, well, it's not, I don't want to say suppress. We want to structure our society so that we have less of it. It's poisonous to free inquiry and free speech. One of the best pieces of advice, the way to think about this, because you have to deal with identity issues, race issues, LGBT, you have to talk about all these issues, which is what tends to be at the heart of these debates, but there are two ways to do it. You can do it by coming together to bond against the enemy, to always see everything in terms of oppressors and victims. We call that common enemy identity politics. Or you can do what was the dominant strand in the civil rights movement. There were multiple strands, but the dominant Martin Luther King, Pauli Murray, which is to appeal to people's humanity and then say some of our brothers and sisters are being denied equal dignity, equal opportunity. As Pauli Murray said, she was a civil rights activist, an Episcopal priest. I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. So again, I ask you to imagine a university based on the three bad ideas. What would it be like? What would it be like to be a person of color in such a place where many people said that they were fighting for you, but the environment would be constant fighting? Or what would it be like to be at a different university based on these three ancient principles, these principles that are consistent with psychological wisdom? What would it be like? So very briefly, just to leave some specific suggestions for how to make things better. If we take the first principle, what can we do? Well, here we have to change the way we raise kids. We have to start letting them out. We have to let them practice independence before they're 16. And so I urge anyone who's a parent with young kids, or if you're grandparents, give these books to your kids. The book Free Range Kids by Lenore Skenazy. And Lenore and I started a website, a program called Let Grow. If you go to letgrow.org, we have a lot of ideas for how you can solve the coordination problem, how you can get your school to back off, give kids some independence, how you can team up with your neighbors to actually let the kids outside to play. So go to letgrow.org. Principle number 2, we're all prone to emotional reasoning, confirmation bias. Every university should be teaching CBT. It's so easy to do. It's so effective against anxiety and depression. You can do it. You can learn it yourself. You can learn it from a book. You can learn it from an app. So we urge, Greg and I urge every university to consider including CBT in orientation training. Also, intellectualvirtues.org has a lot of ideas for how to educate for intellectual humility and other virtues. Principle number 3, we're all prone to dichotomous thinking and tribalism. My colleagues and I have created a program we call Open Mind. If you go to openmindplatform.org, it's a 6-step program. You can run it on any platform, iPhone, PC, laptop, anything. And it walks you through 5 steps. You learn what you'll gain from viewpoint diversity. You learn to cultivate intellectual humility. You learn some psychology about why we get into these fights. You learn how to talk to people who come from different moral worldviews than yourself. So it's a very practical program. It's already being used here at Case in a couple of classes, a couple of programs. It's being used in 130 classes right now around the world. So we have very high hopes for it. We're collecting data to test its efficacy and to make it more effective. So go to openmindplatform.org. It'll work in your church or synagogue, in your company, anywhere where you're finding that people are increasingly polarized and angry, which is pretty much America. And so to close, I just want to quote Ruth Simmons, who was the first African-American president of an Ivy League school, when she said, "Learning is the antithesis of comfort. The collision of views and ideologies is in the DNA of the academic enterprise. We do not need any collision avoidance technology here." And again, this is all about collisions. You can't have a university without collisions, without challenge, without productive conflict. And so I urge you here at Case to stick to our telos, think about the telos of a university, and figure out ways to keep the university close to that telos, keep it far away from the three very bad ideas that are damaging and shaping American education. Thank you very much.
A little bit of time for some questions. There are microphones in the aisles if you have questions. A quick thing, please be sure to make them questions. So, a sentence, maybe a few dependent clauses, ending with an upward inflection. That's designed to elicit a response. And I will steal the prerogative of being here to ask the first question, which is a lot of your talk suggests that for those of us in the university, the problems are already there when students reach us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, as a university, how can we not merely try to embody those truths or those principles that you laid out, but what can we do to try and counteract these problems and in many respects better serve our students and better prepare them for being citizens?
Great. So yes, the problems are there. The mental health crisis is not caused by universities. The same data that we see for universities is true for high school kids. So I think one of the most effective things universities could do is to make it clear that they are admitting for evidence of independent thought and living. The data from Jean Twenge shows, as she says, 18-year-olds today are the equivalent in maturity of 15-year-olds from 20 or 30 years ago, because they haven't been given the chance to practice independence. So we suggest in the book we should reconsider whether 18-year-olds should be in college. Maybe what we should do is have a norm of a gap year. American parents are so horrifically overprotective. What if the top schools all said, we prefer people who've had a gap year. We prefer people who've left home, lived away from their parents, maybe doing work, living in a different part of the country, maybe in the military or public service, something. And we will prefer people who show evidence of that. Well, right away, you would find a lot of very competitive parents giving their kids more independence, because that's what parents are most concerned about. It's not their kids' happiness, it's will he get into a top school? So I think universities and high schools can work together to change our expectations. It's cruel what we're doing to kids, robbing them of childhood in order to get them, ready for college? So I think we could all work together to take the pressure off of kids.
That's sweet.
School at age 14 and those who stay at home until they're 18 before they go away?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know of data on it. I would love to see the data. It's very complicated because there's many things wrapped up in that. Obviously, social class is hugely wrapped up. Kids who go to boarding school are much more likely to come from upper class households. And I haven't been able to get clear whether, we have a whole section on social class in the book. The overprotection happens from middle class all the way up. Working class are much less overprotective, but their kids are exposed to much more trauma. So they have very different reasons for anxiety and depression. So it's really complicated. Boarding schools are incredibly overprotective. So I should look into that more. We could learn something from boarding schools. What we should compare, I guess, if we could find a way of identifying which boarding schools are really overprotective in loco parentis and which ones actually give them experience. I have not done that. I should start asking around for that. Thank you.
I have two quick questions. One is, what did you think frightened the parents of these kids, that they're being so overprotective? And secondly, I'm assuming that when you talk about them being set up for failure, that you're talking beyond the university. So how do you define that failure?
Okay, let's take the second one first. Set up for failure. First of all, the fact that so many kids are now seeking counseling and unable to get it, the fact that so many kids are depressed and anxious throughout their college years. Can you imagine spending, most of us who are older, think back to your college days, and it's like being a kid in a candy shop. It's like, my God, I can take that course, I can go to that talk, all these possibilities, all these interesting people. But you talk to a lot of kids today, and it's like, being a kid in a minefield. There's all these dangers and threats. So I don't think that kids are thriving or enjoying college as much as they used to. And then, yes, the great majority will graduate, but then what happens to them? Very large numbers of them then move back home. We have failure to launch. So we already are seeing the data from the late millennials. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that: student debt, housing prices. It's not just failures within themselves. But parents are complaining and saying, the kids, then my kids' friends, they just don't, they don't have the get up and go because they've been shepherded all the way to college. Then they're shepherded through college, and then they get out. Now what? Go home. So that's what we mean. As for, and I'm sorry, wait, the first question was, what was it again?
What frightened
the parents? Cable TV scared the hell out of them. It was the Eitan Pates murder and the Adam Walsh murder. And then Adam Walsh's dad, those were in 1979, 1981. And then cable TV comes in. So there are hardly any abductions by strangers in this country. It almost never happens that it's an abduction by a stranger. But when it does, it's on TV all the time. So even as the crime wave was ending in the 90s, parents were freaking out. And then social media does it too. So it's the media environment did it to American parents, plus shrinking family size. When you got a lot of kids, frankly, you're not as worried about them.
There's no time. No time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Professor, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed your comments, and I look forward to reading your book. But what you have described to us is, it's taken you years, to really understand as well as you do, and it's very clear you do. And the implications of this trend are not something that you can flip a switch, sign a book, whatever, and it's going to be moving back in the right direction again.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about how long or how much longer you think this gets worse before it starts to get better?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
and maybe if you could just share a little bit about where you are seeing encouraging signs and the kinds of things that people in this room could try to get involved in to
Sure.
perhaps encourage that process to move along a little more quickly.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So if we don't do anything about it, I think things are going to get much worse as far as the eye can see. Fortunately, a new book was just published called The Coddling of the American Mind, which, because the mental health crisis is so serious and because most parents are aware something is going wrong, when Greg and I talk about this, people are really attentive, people want to change. So I actually, and I talked to university presidents and administrators. It's hard enough to be a university president or administrator. Their jobs have gotten so much harder in the last few years because there's all these blow-ups. They never know what's going to hit them. They want a change. So the will is there. Here are a few very simple, here are a few very clear things that could be done that have a big impact. Number one, contact your state legislators here in Ohio and ask them to pass a version of Utah's free-range parenting bill. Utah is the first state in the union that has said that parents cannot be arrested for letting their kids play outside. In much of America, you can be arrested if your kids are caught playing outside because that's child neglect. And once the bureaucracy gets involved, once the Department of Family Services gets involved, they don't have common sense. They have rules, and you will be investigated for months and months. And so it's scary to let your kid outside. So that's number one. Every state should pass, I'm serious about this, contact your state representatives. Ask them to pass a bill in Ohio, a free-range parenting bill. Once that's done, now you and fellow parents can get together and you can say, okay, let's have a play club on Fridays. We should have free-range Fridays. Pick somebody's backyard or a park, and all the kids between ages 8 and 12, they know they can go there. And there's action, there's fun, there's things going on. And maybe you have a designated parent who lives nearby, so if someone gets hurt, the kids can drag the other kid over and, what do we do, Mrs. Smith? But the kids, you have to let the kids play outside without an adult watching them. You have to. So we have a lot of changes to childhood, so go to letgrow.org, lots of suggestions there. At universities, we need clear leadership. The presidents must be firm and clear that we're going to address all these issues together. These are difficult issues. While we're doing this, everybody gets to speak. Nobody gets to intimidate anybody else. If you shout down a speaker, if you intimidate someone for telling their views, you might be expelled. It's a very serious violation of our academic values. You need clear leadership. That's something we've seen in very few universities so far. but I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it. And as far as I know, President Snyder has been clear on this. She's been very concerned about these issues, trying to address all these issues at the same time. So good leadership, rethink orientation. There's a lot that you can do at all levels.
I think we have a question up in the balcony. Am I right?
Let's try to get some current students. Are there any current undergrads online? Okay, are you guys students back there?
No, I have a student with me, but she's in high school.
Okay, well, maybe let her talk. No, what's okay? All right, let's try. Let's see what you have to say.
So my question is there, have you found a difference between children of families in which both parents work, children who grew up in daycare, or those with a stay-at-home parent?
That's a great question. I have no idea. There's huge amounts of research on the differences between outcomes. I wouldn't dare go into it without going fully into it because it's really complicated, so I don't know. Here's a shocking statistic for you, though. If you compare the amount of time that men spend with their children now compared to the 1950s, it's a lot more. Well, that's good, right? That's great. Think about women. How much time are women spending with their kids now compared to the 1950s? How much time are women spending now when most of them work compared to the 1950s when very few of them worked outside the home? Answer, women are spending more time now than they did in the 50s, and they have far fewer children. The point is, we're spending too much time overall parenting our kids in terms of total quantity. Quality time is important, but we spend all our time around them, but on our phones. So we got the worst of all worlds. We're over-supervising them without really attending to them. So I don't know. There might be effects, but I don't know them.
Thank you very much for coming. Yesterday, I'm going to mention Twitter, so bear with me. Yesterday on your Twitter, you responded to an article that had been critical of your new book. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions they had, well, wasn't really phrased in a question, but it was an interesting comment that I wondered what you thought about. And now you've had a full day to think about it. I expect a long, detailed response. But they said that they wondered whether value-neutral searches for truth and classical liberalism had kind of emptied a social cohesion that was actually necessary for the search for truth on campuses, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I was always on the left until I wrote The Righteous Mind, and then I realized that, wow, there's really good ideas from conservatives and libertarians also. And so then I stepped out, I'm not on any team, and I really enjoy reading perspective, like I really take seriously the John Stuart Mill idea that you have to hear things from all sides. And so a conservative critique, we get criticized a lot from the left. We also get criticized from the right in exactly that way. The conservatives have long realized, or their insight is that you need binding social structures, family, religion, something. People need to be bound in. This was Emile Durkheim's great insight in the 1890s. You need to be bound in. And the right blames the left for the sexual revolution, for throwing off the constraints, weakening the family. And so the right is saying, you're reaping what you sowed. This is your fault for all of you who said, let the kid, get rid of social norms. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think we had to change many of the restrictive norms and institutions of the 50s, and I think it went too far in thinking that constraint is bad. I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell and his book Conflict of Visions. I'm sorry, I'm going too far into it. Just to say, I thought it was the best criticism I've had of the book. It was a conservative critique saying that the things we're recommending in the book are too weak, that we're not going to really get back to a thriving, healthy social order until people have a sense of being bound into something that gives them a sense of meaning and belonging. And it can't just be like this therapeutic community. It's something like religion or patriotism, something like that. I think that's a very powerful critique, and I'm thinking about it still.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Good evening. I just wanted to briefly refer to your comment about microaggressions and the misguided intentions with that. Do you think the emphasis in order to solve this should be best placed as a top-down one, or we need to inform institutions of perhaps the benefits of phrasing it as faux pas as opposed to microaggression, more of a bottom-up, where we are trained to better give each other the benefit of the doubt, or do you think equal emphasis needs to be placed on both?
Great question. I think both are necessary. Given the incredible amount of attention and effort and money that universities and high schools are putting into training and giving you vocabulary, I think we do need a top-down change. But where it's only really going to kick in is when the kids who are in high school now start mocking this stuff. If they start making fun of, if they use the word safe space and microaggression only as a joke, and I hear they are doing that. So kids are subversive, and if the kids themselves are saying, screw that, we're going to figure out these diversity issues ourselves. Now, it might be that they just make it worse, and and the internet makes it nasty stuff. But if kids themselves figure out ways to talk among themselves and work out problems for themselves and conflicts for themselves, then I think things will really change.
Thank you.
Go back up to the balcony.
Hi. Oh, there we go. I'm a graduate student here, so I'm a professional. I'm a nurse practitioner, and then I'm in a doctoral nursing program here at Case. And so the cost of the education is necessarily always on my mind. I paid $2,011 per credit hour to attend, which is, a lot of money to me. Probably, I would think, to anyone. And it's a really good school. And I'm happy to come here. I just wonder, within your, I haven't read your books, pardon me. Within your research, have you found a relationship between the rising cost of particularly secondary education in U.S., particularly since the 1980s, and the increase in depression and anxiety?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of people try to find relations between external, like economic factors, debt, the global financial crisis, unemployment, and those things tend not to have much impact on people's happiness. Even after the global financial crisis, depression didn't really rise. We tend to be much more affected by local things and relational things. So debt is a serious problem, but I don't see any relation between it, it's been rising steadily, but the depression only began going up after 2011. Similarly, many people say, well, of course students are depressed, the financial crisis and unemployment. Well, no, the bottom dropped out in 2008, 2009. Anybody who graduated in 2009, 2010, was in big trouble. But every year since then, the job market and the economy has gotten better and better and better. And as it's getting better and better and better, depression is going up and up and up. One is not causing the other. I'm just saying that if you're looking for the explanations of this in external or economic things, you're not going to find it. The economy fluctuates all the time, back to the depression and before. You don't see links to mental health between those things. So no, I don't think that's what's causing it. It's a separate problem. Have we had any questions from current undergrads? Are there any? I'd love to get some questions or criticism, especially from undergrads. If you think I've said something wrong you disagree with, I'd love to hear from you. So anybody wants to jump in line and say that? Okay, please, come on up. Sorry, I just think it's, okay. Please come up. No, please, because we're almost out of time. So if you're undergrad, please come up to the front. Or, unless you're an undergrad? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, good. Please, I'm so sorry. Okay, go.
Hi. First of all, I'm a big fan of you, so thank you for coming here.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One,
let's do two of them.
Okay, I am a member of iGen. I was born in 1999. I was wondering what, besides, as you mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy, could I do to alleviate these qualms that I have with my own life? And then also, what do you do with your children to prepare them for the world?
Great. So we often think that you need to be taught something. That, okay, so a lot of universities are now giving courses on failure. We have to teach you how to fail, right? Okay, no, we learn from experience primarily. And so think of yourself, you've got this brain inside you, which is still myelinating, still developing. You have to, think of it almost as your dog, you want to walk your dog around and show it all sorts of things. I'm sorry, that's a bad analogy, never mind that one. You've got to give yourself a lot of experiences where you put yourself in a situation that you're a little scared of, but you're not going to die. And so I would suggest traveling alone, or be more ambitious, traveling far away, but with a friend. Putting yourself in situations where it's a little scary, and just do that over and over again. So I used to travel. I traveled around. I would do 2-month trips by myself. And I was always really kind of scared when I was going to the airport and getting on a plane. But you go, I would go to Europe or South America, and then you meet people. It's a lot of fun. So I would suggest really think of it as though, I don't know anything about your background, but I'm assuming that you were overprotected. At what age were you able to go outside on your own?
12.
Okay. So you're deficient in experience. Don't tell your parents I said this, but with the best of intentions, they have slowed down your development.
I agree.
What? It's what? What do you say?
I didn't hear it.
Okay. Anyway, so that's okay. And what I did with my kids. So once I read Lenore Skenazy's book, my wife and I tried to send them out more. My son, when I would try to send him to the store across the street, and we live in Manhattan, which is incredibly safe. There's like no crime. It's as safe as when my parents were growing up in New York in the 30s. So I would try to send them out, but my son would say, "But Dad, people look at me funny. There are no other kids out there." But we just kept going, and then and then especially once he had to take the subway to school in 6th grade. So for him at 11. At first, he was a little scared of the subway, but it only took 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, he's great. He knows the subway so much better than I do. He goes all over the city now. So you have to challenge yourself and push through the feelings of fear, and that's the way you grow.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question, right?
Hi. So I have two small questions. One is, considering the fact that we're combating against cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, liking, disliking bias, and tribalism, but also like mob mentality, how do you recommend that we as individuals approach, since it's hard because they're going to want to shut you down, how do you approach someone that's trying to say that your ideas are wrong, or even if you're just trying to convince them that it's a good idea to at least hear other people out in a peaceful manner and have this dialogue? How do you recommend approaching that, or do you think it's not possible? And the other small one is, after the lecture, is there any chance you could sign my copy of The Happiness Hypothesis?
Yes. Happy to do so.
We were able to get the University Barnes & Noble to make books available in, I guess it's the hallway over there, and there will be at least some time for book signing as well.
Yeah, so on the second question, yes. On the first question, I love the way you phrased it. How do you deal with somebody who's trying to attack your ideas? The answer is you say thank you, because we all suffer from confirmation bias. Scientists aren't great because they're so smart. Scientists are great because they join a community which institutionalizes attack. If I publish something, if I put something out there, it will be attacked. So I better have my ducks in a row. And so when that conservative person wrote a critique of the book, I thanked him for it. It was some really good ideas. I wouldn't have thought of those things. So you have to have an attitude of saying we are all imperfect. We are all arrogant. We are all hypocritical, self-righteous. We need others to challenge us. It's not an attack. It's helpful to you. So I would urge everybody go. So John Stuart Mill's book, On Liberty, one of the greatest works ever on speech and learning. Go to heterodoxacademy.org/Mill. We have an illustrated version of just chapter 2, edited to be half its size, very readable. Read that, you'll understand why you should say thank you. More broadly, and this gives me, thank you for the question, because this is a perfect chance for me to, you always want to end on an inspiring note, especially if you give a dark, scary talk. Something I'm thinking a lot about is we are all drowning in outrage. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I was always on the left. I hated the Republicans. And like every month, there'd be some new terrible thing that the Republicans did or said. And we'd talk about how terrible the Republicans are. Okay? Well, now, it's not every day. It's every hour. It's every minute. And it's got a video attached. Yeah. So it's like we're being force-fed. We're not forced. Our friends are putting it in our mouths, and we're swallowing whole, amounts of poison. Yeah. And so here's my suggestion. I'm thinking of writing something on this. I think we all need to take the anti-outrage pledge, because there's way too much. We're choking on it. And so let's try it. I'm going to suggest that everybody say this to conclude. It goes like this. I will give less offense. I will take less offense. I will pass on less offense. That means I will give less offense. I will try to do fewer faux pas. I will try to be more sensitive. But at the same time, I will try to be more insensitive about things coming in. I will take less offense. I'll give other people the benefit of the doubt. And of all the things that come in and all the things I send out, I'm going to cut that by 90%. Because if you think about it, if you pass on only 10% of what you normally do, then you're still 50 times more outraged than you were 10 years ago. Okay, so consider if you're willing to say that with me. You don't have to. It's just a nice, an uplifting way to end it. So I'll say each of those 3 statements. You just, if you want to, say it after me. I will give less offense.
I will give less offense.
I will take less offense.
I will take less offense.
I will pass on less offense.
I will pass on less offense.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Professor Haidt, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you all for being here.